The war in the Pacific was falling apart for Japan. American bombers flew over Tokyo almost every night now, turning entire neighborhoods into ash. American forces had captured island after island, moving closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. Soldiers knew what this meant. The empire was losing, but no one was allowed to say it out loud. Every Japanese soldier learned the same lesson from the day they joined the military: death before surrender. Surrender was the ultimate shame, worse than death itself. Officers told their men that if Americans captured them, they would be tortured slowly, their bodies mutilated, their honor destroyed forever. This wasn't just military talk. This was drilled into their heads every single day. The propaganda went even deeper than fear of torture. Japanese soldiers were taught a strict hierarchy of races, with Japanese people at the very top. They learned that white Americans were materialistic and weak, but that black Americans were something else entirely, something less than human. Military instructors showed propaganda films depicting black people as primitive and dangerous. The message was clear. These were not people deserving of respect or dignity. These beliefs didn't start in the military. Japanese children learned them in school, heard them on the radio, saw them in newspapers. By the time a young man became a soldier, these ideas felt like facts, like gravity or sunrise. When Private Takeshi Yamamoto and 50 other Japanese soldiers were captured on Okinawa in late February 1945, they expected to die within hours. Some had tried to kill themselves before capture but failed. Now they sat in the bottom of a transport ship, hands bound, heads down, waiting for the torture to begin. The ship took them to Hawaii first, then to California, then by train across the entire width of America. Through the small windows, they saw something that confused them. Cities that weren't bombed, factories running at full speed, cars everywhere, so many cars, farms with crops growing thick and green. They had been told America was struggling, that Japan was winning. But through those train windows, they saw a country that looked nothing like the one their officers described. The train finally stopped in central Louisiana, and the prisoners were loaded onto trucks. They arrived at Camp Livingston in early March 1945. The camp sprawled across 47,000 acres of pine forest and red clay soil. At its peak, it held 9,000 prisoners of war, mostly German but with a dedicated section for Japanese POWs. The fence was tall and topped with barbed wire, guard towers positioned at each corner. This was still a prison, but it was a prison in Louisiana, in the heart of the Jim Crow South, where race ruled everything. The prisoners were marched into a large wooden barracks. An American officer read them the rules through a translator. They would work 6 days a week. They would receive 2,800 calories of food per day. They would be paid 80 cents per day for their labor, about $24 per month. Yamamoto listened but didn't believe it. This had to be a trick, some elaborate setup before the real torture began. That first night they were given dinner. Beef stew with potatoes and carrots, 2 thick slices of white bread with butter, canned peaches and milk, real milk in glass bottles. Yamamoto and the others ate slowly, suspiciously, waiting for someone to take it away or for the food to make them sick. It didn't. They went to sleep on actual beds, with thin mattresses and rough wool blankets. Some men cried quietly in the dark, confused about why they were still alive. The next morning brought the first real shock, the one that would change everything. The guards who came to wake them and march them to breakfast were black, not white Americans, but black Americans. And it wasn't just the guards. When they arrived at the mess hall, the cooks serving their food were black. The men cleaning the floors were black. Throughout that first week, they realized that much of the daily operation of their section of the camp involved black workers, both military and civilian. This made no sense. The propaganda had taught them that black people in America were kept like animals, that white Americans would never trust them with any responsibility. Yet here they were, in positions of authority, carrying guns, giving orders, managing the prisoners' daily lives. The Japanese prisoners had been taught that they were racially superior to these people, but they were the ones behind the fence. The black guards had uniforms, weapons, authority. The black cooks controlled whether the prisoners ate or went hungry. The hierarchy they had been promised didn't exist here, or if it did, it was flipped in a way that made their heads spin. And there was something else, something none of them expected. The black workers didn't treat them with cruelty. There was no torture, no beatings, no humiliation. There was professional distance, yes, but also something that looked almost like basic human decency. By the end of the first week, Yamamoto noticed women among the workers. Black women who worked in the laundry facility, who served food in the officers' section, who handled administrative paperwork. They were young, some barely 20 years old, wearing simple dresses and head wraps, going about their work with efficiency and pride. When the prisoners marched past them to work details, some of the women glanced up, not with hatred or fear, but with something closer to curiosity. Yamamoto found himself watching one woman in particular, noticing the way she smiled at something another worker said, the way she carried folded laundry with careful precision. He pushed the thought away quickly, ashamed. But it came back the next day, and the day after that. Something was shifting, something dangerous. These men had been prepared to die for their emperor. They had been taught exactly who they were and where they stood in the world. But in this Louisiana prison camp, surrounded by people they were supposed to despise and who were supposed to despise them, that certainty was beginning to crack. The question forming in Yamamoto's mind, the question he couldn't ask out loud yet, was simple and terrifying. What if everything we were told was a lie? The abundance hit them in waves, each one more impossible than the last. Every morning at 6:30, the prisoners lined up for breakfast. 8 ounces of fresh eggs, scrambled and still steaming. 4 strips of bacon, crispy and salty. Toast with real butter, not the synthetic spread Japanese civilians had been eating since 1943. Coffee with sugar and cream, as much as they wanted. Yamamoto remembered his last meal in Japan before shipping out. A small bowl of rice mixed with barley to stretch it further. A few pickled vegetables, weak miso soup with almost no tofu. His mother had apologized for how little there was. She had been eating less than that, saving food for him and his younger brothers. Now he stood in a prison camp, eating more food in one morning than his mother probably ate in 3 days. The guilt sat in his stomach heavier than the bacon. The work assignment started in the second week. Most prisoners were sent to forestry crews, cutting timber in the pine forests surrounding the camp. They worked 8 hours a day with a lunch break in the middle. Lunch was brought out to them in trucks, sandwiches thick with ham or roast beef, apples, cookies, and cold lemonade. Yamamoto watched the guards throw away half-eaten sandwiches. He watched them pour leftover lemonade onto the ground. Back home, nothing was wasted. People saved vegetable scraps to make broth. Children licked their bowls clean. Here, abundance was so common that waste didn't even register as wrong. The American guards tossed food away like it was nothing, because to them, it was nothing. There would always be more. On a Thursday afternoon in late March, a Coca-Cola delivery truck rolled up to the camp's main area. Yamamoto and a dozen other prisoners were unloading supply crates nearby. They stopped to watch as case after case of glass bottles came off the truck. The driver chatted with the guard, laughing about something, completely casual. The truck had to be carrying 300 bottles, maybe more. Yamamoto had seen Coca-Cola exactly once in his life, in a shop window in Tokyo before the war. It cost more than his father made in a day. Here it came by the truckload, delivered to a prison camp for guards to drink while watching prisoners work. The contrast was so sharp it felt like a physical pain in his chest. Japan was starving itself to build warships and planes. America was so rich it gave soda pop to prison guards. The industrial efficiency showed up everywhere. The camp kitchen could feed 2,000 men 3 hot meals a day without any apparent strain. Yamamoto got assigned to kitchen detail 1 week and saw the operation up close. Huge steel mixers that could handle 50 pounds of dough at once. Industrial ovens that could bake 100 loaves of bread simultaneously. Walk-in freezers the size of small houses, packed with hanging sides of beef and pork. A black woman named Dorothy ran the vegetable prep station. She supervised 4 other workers who peeled potatoes using mechanical peelers that could handle a 50-pound sack in 10 minutes. Yamamoto had watched his mother peel potatoes by hand, one at a time, carefully saving every bit because food was precious. Here, machines did it faster than his mind could process. Dorothy noticed him staring. She smiled, not unkindly, and said something in English he didn't understand. She pointed at the machine, then at the mountain of peeled potatoes, then shrugged as if to say this was normal, this was just how things worked here. The cultural kindness came in small moments that accumulated over weeks. A guard named Jackson started teaching basic English to prisoners who seemed interested. He did this during his breaks, sitting on the barracks steps with a notepad, pointing at objects and saying their names. Yamamoto joined these sessions. Jackson never mocked them for mispronouncing words. He corrected gently, repeated patiently, and seemed genuinely pleased when someone got something right. This wasn't in Jackson's job description. He wasn't paid extra for it. He just did it because some part of him saw confused young men far from home and decided to help them communicate. On the 4th of July, 1945, the camp held a celebration. The prisoners weren't exactly invited, but they weren't excluded either. They watched from their barracks area as guards and civilian workers set up tables, grilled hamburgers and hot dogs, played music on a phonograph. Then something unexpected happened. One of the officers ordered ice cream brought out to the prisoners, not the guards' leftovers. Fresh ice cream, scooped into bowls, one for each prisoner. Vanilla and chocolate, two flavors that most of these men had never tasted in their entire lives. Yamamoto held the cold bowl, watching the ice cream slowly melt, unable to quite believe this was real. Japan's soldiers were eating grass and tree bark on isolated Pacific islands. He was in an enemy prison eating ice cream on America's birthday. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme he almost laughed, but the laugh caught in his throat and came out as something closer to a sob. The church services started in May. A black chaplain opened Sunday services to any prisoners who wanted to attend. About 20 Japanese men went that first week, mostly out of curiosity or boredom. The chaplain spoke about mercy and forgiveness and the dignity of all human beings in God's eyes. Yamamoto didn't understand every word, but he understood the tone, the gentleness, the complete absence of superiority or hatred. After the service, the choir sang 10 black women in simple choir robes, their voices rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to vibrate in Yamamoto's bones. One of the singers was the woman from the laundry, the one he had noticed that first week. Her eyes were closed as she sang, her face peaceful and focused. He felt something shift inside him, some wall beginning to develop cracks. The work details brought daily interaction. Yamamoto got assigned to help maintain the laundry facility, basic repairs, and heavy lifting. This meant working near the women who processed the camp's clothes and linens. The woman from the choir was there. Her name was Ruth. He learned this by listening to the other women call her name. Ruth was 23 years old, though Yamamoto didn't know that yet. She was efficient with her work, folding sheets with quick, practiced motions, but she also hummed while she worked, little snatches of melodies that made the industrial laundry room feel less harsh. When Yamamoto carried a heavy basket of wet laundry to the drying area, Ruth said, "Thank you." Just those 2 words, but she looked directly at him when she said them, acknowledging him as a person who had done something helpful, not as an enemy, not as someone beneath her, just as another human being sharing space and work. Other prisoners noticed similar things with other women. The quiet accumulation of small dignities, a smile, a patient repetition of an English word, a shared cigarette during a break. These weren't grand gestures. They were tiny moments of ordinary human decency. But for men who had been taught that these particular humans were inferior, and who now found themselves imprisoned and dependent on these same humans for food, shelter, and basic kindness, each small moment was a hammer blow against everything they thought they knew. Yamamoto started requesting extra shifts on laundry detail. He told himself it was to earn more of the 80 cents per day, but he knew the real reason. He was beginning to seek out Ruth's presence the way a plant seeks sunlight. Something was growing that shouldn't be growing. Something that both nations, Japan and America, had explicitly forbidden, and he was terrified of how much he wanted to let it grow anyway. August 15th, 1945. The day started like any other, with breakfast at 6:30 and work assignments at 7. But by noon, guards were running between buildings, shouting to each other, and the camp's administrative offices buzzed with unusual activity. Something major had happened. The prisoners were called back from their work details early and assembled in the main yard. An officer stood on a platform with a translator and a radio. He announced that Japan had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. Emperor Hirohito himself had spoken on the radio, something that had never happened before in Japanese history. The divine emperor, whose voice common people were never supposed to hear, had told his subjects that the war was lost and they must accept defeat. The officer played a recording of the emperor's speech. The voice came through, scratchy and distant, using formal court Japanese that was hard to understand. But the meaning was clear enough. Japan had endured the unendurable and suffered the insufferable. The empire had fallen. For Yamamoto and the other prisoners, this moment shattered something fundamental. They had been raised to believe the emperor was divine, that Japan could never lose, that death was preferable to surrender. Their entire country had surrendered. Everything they had been told to die for had ended with that thin, distant voice on a radio speaker. Some men fell to their knees, others stood frozen, faces blank with shock. A few wept openly, not bothering to hide their tears. The guards watched quietly, giving them space to process what had just happened. That evening, Yamamoto sat on his bunk and stared at the wooden wall. His mind kept trying to make sense of it and failing. He had been captured in February. He had spent 6 months in this camp, eating better food than he had ever eaten in his life, treated with more basic dignity than his own officers had ever shown him. And now the war was over, and everything he had believed about honor and duty and racial superiority had been revealed as a lie that ended in surrender. He thought about his family back in Japan, wondered if they were alive, if their house still stood, if they had enough food to survive. He thought about the wasted years, the wasted lives, the boys who had killed themselves rather than surrender because they believed what they were told. The next morning, Ruth found him during the breakfast cleanup. She approached carefully, her face soft with something that looked like concern. She said his name, or her version of it, the syllables slightly wrong but gentle. She asked if he was okay, using simple words and hand gestures to make sure he understood. Yamamoto tried to explain, but his English wasn't good enough for the complexity of what he felt. He said okay several times, nodding, but his eyes must have shown something different because Ruth didn't look convinced. She did something then that changed everything. She reached out and briefly touched his shoulder, just a quick touch, barely a second, but it was deliberate and kind. Then she said something he had learned in Jackson's English lessons. It's going to be all right. That simple gesture, that brief touch, opened a door Yamamoto had been trying to keep closed. Ruth saw him, not as an enemy soldier, not as a prisoner, not as someone from an inferior race or a superior one. She saw a young man far from home, grieving the collapse of everything he had known, and she offered comfort. In that moment, Yamamoto understood that everything Japan had taught him about racial hierarchy was as much a lie as everything they had taught him about winning the war. Ruth had more dignity in her smallest gesture than his commanding officers had shown in years of service. The contrast was so complete it felt like waking up from a nightmare into a confusing but gentler reality. The church service that Sunday carried a different weight. The black chaplain spoke about new beginnings and the possibility of redemption even after terrible things. He talked about how suffering can break people open and let new understanding in. Yamamoto sat in the back row and listened with an intensity he had never brought to any religious service before. When the choir sang, Ruth's voice rose above the others in a solo line, clear and strong, and full of something that sounded like hope. Yamamoto felt tears on his face and didn't wipe them away. He wasn't crying for Japan's defeat anymore. He was crying because he had been taught to hate these people, these specific people in this room, and they had responded with kindness. They had every reason to be cruel, and they chose mercy instead. The shame of his former beliefs mixed with gratitude for their grace and created an emotion he had no name for. After the service, Ruth approached him again. This time she brought another woman with her who spoke a little Japanese, having worked before the war in a town with Japanese immigrant farmers. Through this halting translation, Ruth asked Yamamoto about his family, about his home, about what he would do now that the war was over. He tried to explain about his mother and brothers, about the city he came from, about how he didn't know if any of it still existed. Ruth listened with full attention, her eyes never leaving his face. Then she told him, through the translator, about her own family. Her father had died 2 years ago. Her mother cleaned houses for white families in town. Her younger brother was in the army, stationed in Italy, and she hadn't heard from him in 3 months. They were both young people whose lives had been shaped by a war neither of them wanted, both worried about family members they couldn't reach, both trying to find footing in a world that had just shifted under their feet. The conversation lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it changed the nature of everything between them. They weren't prisoner and worker anymore. They were two people who had shared something real. Over the following weeks, they found ways to talk more. Ruth would time her breaks to when Yamamoto was on laundry detail. Yamamoto started studying English with desperate focus, learning new words every day so he could say more to her. Jackson noticed and started teaching him specific phrases, smiling knowingly but never saying anything directly. Other prisoners noticed too. Some disapproved silently. Others were developing their own careful friendships with black women who worked in the camp or lived in the nearby town. About a dozen Japanese prisoners were walking this same forbidden path, drawn to connections that both America and Japan had declared impossible and wrong. Ruth told him one day, speaking slowly so he would understand, that he was different than what she had been told Japanese people were like. Yamamoto understood that she meant this as a compliment, but it made him sad. He told her, using his limited English and many hand gestures, that she was different than what he had been told too. They looked at each other then, with full recognition of what that meant. Two governments had spent years telling lies about each other's people to justify a war. They had both believed those lies, and now they stood in a Louisiana prison camp, across the widest racial divide either country recognized, realizing that the lies had never been true, that people were just people, complicated and flawed and capable of unexpected kindness. Ruth smiled at him, a real smile that reached her eyes, and Yamamoto smiled back. In that moment, he understood something that would shape the rest of his life. The war had taken everything from him, his innocence and his certainty and his belief in the empire he had served. But it had also brought him here, to this place, to this woman, to this sudden understanding that love and human connection recognize no borders, no propaganda, no carefully constructed hierarchies of race. He didn't have the English words to tell her what he was feeling. He didn't need them. She knew. He could see it in her face. Something was growing between them that both nations had tried to make impossible, and neither of them wanted to stop it. The repatriation orders started coming in November 1945. Ships were being prepared to take Japanese prisoners back home. The process would take months, moving thousands of men across the Pacific, but it was beginning. Officers posted lists of names on the barracks bulletin boards, organized by departure dates. Yamamoto's name appeared on a list scheduled for March 1946. He had 4 months left in Louisiana, 4 months left with Ruth. The thought of leaving felt like being told he had to cut off his own arm. He had survived the war, survived capture, survived the collapse of everything he believed. And now he was supposed to get on a ship and sail away from the only thing that made sense anymore. Other prisoners felt the same way. Quiet conversations happened in corners of the barracks late at night. Men whispered about staying, about finding ways to delay their departure, about the impossibility of explaining to anyone back home what they had experienced here. How could you tell your family that you fell in love with a black American woman while you were a prisoner of war? How could you make them understand that the enemy had treated you better than your own military ever did? The words didn't exist for that conversation. The cultural framework didn't exist. Some men decided they would go back and pretend none of this had happened, that they would bury these months deep inside and never speak of them. But others, including Yamamoto, started exploring a different option. The legal situation was complicated. Technically, the prisoners were still under military custody until formally repatriated. But America was dealing with hundreds of thousands of POWs from multiple countries. The bureaucracy was enormous and slow. If someone wanted to delay their return, if they claimed they needed more time for medical reasons or administrative issues, the system could be worked. And if someone wanted to stay permanently, there were pathways, though none of them were easy. They would need employment, sponsors, permission from multiple government agencies. For a Japanese man wanting to stay in the Jim Crow South to marry a black woman, the obstacles weren't just bureaucratic. They were social, cultural, and racial, but some men decided to try anyway. Yamamoto talked to Ruth about it in December, a week before Christmas. They had been meeting regularly now, finding private moments during work details or after church services. Their relationship had progressed slowly, carefully, both of them aware of how dangerous it was. But it was real. He loved her. He was almost certain she loved him back, though they had never said the words directly. His English was much better now after months of intensive study, good enough to have real conversations. He asked her if she would want him to stay if he could find a way. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she told him it would be hard. Not just hard for him, but hard for both of them. A Japanese man and a black woman together would face hatred from multiple directions. White people wouldn't accept it. Black people might not accept it. His own people definitely wouldn't accept it. They would be outsiders everywhere they went. But then Ruth said something that Yamamoto would remember for the rest of his life. She said that she had spent her whole life being told who she could be and who she couldn't be, where she could go and where she couldn't go, who she could love and who she couldn't love. She said she was tired of letting other people's hatred make her decisions for her. She said if he wanted to stay, and if he was willing to face what staying would mean, then yes, she would want him to stay too. They held hands then, sitting on a bench behind the laundry building where no one could see them, and made a decision that would alter both of their futures completely. By February 1946, 5 Japanese prisoners had formally refused repatriation. 3 others had requested delays, citing various reasons but really wanting more time to make the same decision. Military authorities were confused and frustrated. German prisoners had sometimes requested to stay, usually for economic opportunities or because they feared prosecution back home. But Japanese prisoners staying was unusual, and when investigators quietly discovered that romantic relationships with black women were involved, the situation became even more complicated. Interracial marriage was illegal in Louisiana. Even if these men stayed, they couldn't legally marry the women they loved. The military didn't want the public relations nightmare this could create, but they also couldn't force men onto ships against their will, not with the war over and international observers watching how America treated POWs. Yamamoto wasn't one of the 5 who refused outright. He was smarter than that, or maybe just more cautious. He got on the ship in March 1946. He sailed across the Pacific with 300 other former prisoners, but he had made Ruth a promise. He would go back, see his family, make sure they were alive and had what they needed. Then he would find a way to return to America. It might take months or years, but he would come back. Ruth said she would wait. She gave him a small photograph of herself, the only one she owned, tucked into his jacket pocket the day he left. He gave her his military dog tags, the ones that identified him as a soldier of the Japanese Empire. He didn't want them anymore. He wanted her to have something of his to hold while he was gone. The ship landed in Yokohama in April 1946. The Japan Yamamoto returned to was nothing like the country he had left. American bombs had destroyed most major cities. Tokyo was a landscape of rubble and ash. People lived in shacks made from scrap metal and burned wood. Everyone looked thin, with hollow cheeks and empty eyes. Food was scarce. Work was scarce. The economy had collapsed. The emperor was still alive but had renounced his divinity. American occupation forces controlled everything. The country Yamamoto had been told to die for no longer existed in any meaningful sense. He found his family living in a temporary shelter on the outskirts of what used to be their neighborhood. His mother had survived. One brother had survived. The other had died on Iwo Jima. Their house was gone, burned in the firebombing raids. His mother cried when she saw him, touching his face like she couldn't believe he was real. She had received notification that he was a prisoner, but hadn't known if he would ever come home. Yamamoto stayed with them for 3 weeks, helping them rebuild a small shelter, sharing the money he had saved from his POW wages, about $300 that was worth a fortune in devastated Japan. He bought rice and vegetables on the black market. He bartered for tools and building materials. He made sure they would survive. But he couldn't tell them about Ruth. He couldn't explain where his heart was, or why he seemed distant even while sitting right next to them. His mother asked if he was all right, if the Americans had hurt him. He told her, no, the Americans had treated him well. She looked confused, Like this answer didn't match what she expected. He didn't elaborate. How could he tell her that American prisoners ate better than Japanese civilians? That American abundance was so extreme it had broken his understanding of the world? That he had fallen in love with a woman his country would never accept? The gap between his experience and her understanding was too wide to cross with words. 3 other men from his camp had made it back to Japan with similar plans. They met secretly in Tokyo, pooling information about how to get visas to return to America. It wasn't easy. Japan was occupied, and most Japanese citizens couldn't leave. But some work programs were starting, some educational exchanges. If they were patient and persistent, there might be a way. One man had already received letters from the black woman he loved, smuggled through military mail channels. She was waiting for him. She hadn't given up. This gave all of them hope that their own women were waiting too. Yamamoto did return to Louisiana in 1948 through a complicated process involving a work visa sponsored by a lumber company that needed Japanese translators for trade negotiations. He found Ruth exactly where she said she would be, still working at the camp that was now being converted to other uses. They couldn't legally marry in Louisiana, so they moved to California, where laws were slightly less restrictive. They married in a small ceremony with no family present, just 2 friends as witnesses. They had 3 children over the next decade. Those children grew up hearing 2 languages, learning 2 cultures, belonging fully to neither but creating something new from both. The other men who stayed or returned had similar stories. Some succeeded in building lives with the women they loved. Others were broken by the constant pressure and prejudice and eventually gave up. All of them carried the same strange knowledge, the same unbridgeable gap between what they had experienced and what anyone back home could understand. They had been captured as soldiers programmed to die rather than surrender. They left as men who had learned that everything they believed about race and honor and national identity was constructed to serve power rather than truth. In a Jim Crow prison camp, guarded and cared for by people both nations had deemed inferior, they found something neither empire wanted them to discover. They found that love and dignity and human connection recognized no propaganda, no borders, no carefully maintained racial hierarchies. Years later, when Yamamoto was an old man, his grandson asked him about the war. Yamamoto thought for a long time before answering. Finally, he said that the war taught him that the most dangerous thing to any nation built on lies is simple human kindness. Across the very lines those lies insist are uncrossable. He said he had been prepared to die for an empire. Instead, he learned to live for love. The empire fell. The love remained. And that, he told his grandson, was the only victory that mattered.